A few weeks ago, the Department of Inter-Orthodox, Ecumenical and Interfaith Relations of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America initiated a series of webinar discussions and panel interviews on racism and injustice, prompted by unrest and protest throughout the country. But we wanted also to probe other challenging issues, perhaps related, but certainly apparent in our communities, such as anti-Semitism. There must be some link with the Passover story and liberation from slavery. As an Orthodox Christian, I know I am appalled and scandalized by certain statements in some parts of the Orthodox world by bishops and theologians regarding our Jewish sisters and brothers, or by anti-Semitic assumptions in general about our scripture, history, and liturgy. So what is the role of the church or religion, which has often led some Christians who do not like to think of themselves as anti-Semitic to harbor views that ultimately reinforce anti-Semitism? Some of this, I suspect, may emerge from a narrow worldview that ignores what happens in the broader society as somehow being related or even directly connected to what happens in the church or in the heart. But some of it stems from a misunderstanding or lack of understanding about the roots of anti-Semitism. I'm very grateful to be speaking with four special guests and friends. Dr. Amy Jill Levine is Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Vanderbilt Divinity School and Department of Jewish Studies. Her more than 30 books include The Misunderstood Jew, The Church and the Scandal of the Jewish Jesus. She has even published 4 children's books with Sandy Sasso. Her most recent book with Mark Brettler is The Bible with and Without Jesus, How Jews and Christians Read the Same Stories Differently. In 2019, she became the first Jew to teach New Testament at the Pontifical Biblical Institute. Dr. John Fotopoulos is Associate Professor in the Department of Religious Studies and Theology at St. Mary's College, Notre Dame, Indiana, where he has taught since 2001. He received a BA in pre-theology from Hellenic College and an MDiv from Holy Cross School of Theology. He received his PhD from Loyola University, Chicago, with a specialization in New Testament and early Christianity. John is an Archon of the Order of St. Andrew, where he holds the title Teacher of the Gospel, bestowed by His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew. Dr. Margaret Mitchell is Distinguished Service Professor of New Testament and Early Christian Literature at the University of Chicago. She is a literary historian of ancient Christianity, while her research and many publications span a range of topics in the New Testament, especially the Pauline letters, and early Christian writings up through the end of the 4th century. Her forthcoming book, John Chrysostom on Paul, Praises and Problem Texts, includes translations and analyses of 25 homilies by St. John Chrysostom, many of which have never been translated into English. And Dr. James Skedros is Professor of Byzantine Studies at Hellenic College and Holy Cross School of Theology. He served as Dean of Holy Cross from 2013 to 2018. His teaching and research areas include the history of early and Byzantine Christianity, the lives of early Christian and Byzantine saints, as well as Christian-Muslim relations. He is a double recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship, both of these for the study of Byzantine saints in Thessaloniki, Greece. Let's open with some general observations. And let me start with you, Jim, and ask you, when is it that the church separates from the synagogue? That is to say, at what point in the early history of Christianity do Christians become distinct from their Jewish brothers and sisters?
Thanks, Father John. So it's a tough question to answer because you can't really point to a moment. Without a doubt, Christianity, and scholarship over the last 50 years has clearly demonstrated this. The roots of Christianity belong in Judaism, and I'm sure we'll talk a whole lot more about that. But if you sort of look at maybe the Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of John, think about the events of the Jewish War from 66 to 72, 73 AD, you sort of start to get together a picture, and you have to look at early Christian texts that have survived, start to get a picture that somewhere around 50, 60 AD to somewhere, scholars tend to put this towards the end of the 2nd century, maybe 100-year period or so in which one can start to unravel what we would generally think of the separation of church and from synagogue. But there is no particular moment at which this takes place. And usually the period of 70 to 170, 180, 190 AD are bookend by the destruction of Jerusalem, the temple in particular in 70 AD, the writings of Matthew around 80, the writings of John around 90, 100 on one end, which starts to really give us some serious evidence that there is this tension between Jews and Christians, if we want to use those identity markers. And around 170, 180, when you finally see the writings published by Justin Martyr, who is a Christian writing somewhere between 130 and 160 AD, and he has a very lengthy dialogue with a Jew named Trypho. And if you add to that perhaps Melito of Sardis, who was a Christian bishop in a city where there was a large Jewish community in Sardis around 180, 190, and he has a beautiful hymn or homily on Passover and Christian Pascha, which he really attacks any continuity between Israel and the church and says the church is now Israel. And then if you throw in sort of a non-canonical person, if you will, Marcion, who really tried to separate the God of the Jews from the God of Jesus, which he's active around 160, 170 AD, maybe a bit earlier. That 100-year period is really kind of a critical period for this separation, but it doesn't stop there, right? Christians in the 3rd and 4th centuries, as Margaret's work has shown, and with John Chrysostom, the question about Christian affinity towards Judaism is alive and well in the 3rd and 4th centuries.
Right. Well, thank you. I want to come back actually to this topic, but Margaret, I know you have a visual of this separation and desired connection. Do you want to share that with us? And you need to unmute yourself.
Yes, and I do also want to come back to some of the questions about possible models for the chronological and also just what counts as the separation of church and synagogue, what counts as church and synagogue. But here's one image for all of us to think with, or a series of images of what do we mean when we think about the church and the synagogue and their either separation or their unity. So here goes. So this, what you see first here is a juxtaposition of that's the ecclesia, the church on the left, and synagoga or the synagogue on the right. This is an all too frequent feature of medieval Christian art, and this particular one from Cathédrale Notre-Dame de Strasbourg. There's so much going on in this iconography, but I think you can just see in particular that the church, she has a triumphant staff as compared with the synagogue, who has a broken staff. The church has a crown of triumph and victory and royalty, and the synagoga is with bare head as of a vanquished enemy. The church holds the Eucharist as her triumphant symbol of the liturgical communion, and the synagogue holds a Torah down, sort of again in a gesture of humiliation. And most importantly, if you look at the face of the synagogue on the right, she is blindfolded. And this is an ideological description of Jews as those who were blind to the church's reality, the church's truth, and what it proclaims of Christ. This is a very frequent image in medieval art, as I said, and it's an image of complete separation between church and synagogue, as you can see when I turn to the full context in the next image, where you can see they're completely opposed and completely separated. And imagine what the pilgrims and others thought as they walked through those doors. For them, the church and synagogue are graphically being portrayed as always and ever completely separate, one true and one false, one sighted, one blind. This is extremely disturbing, iconographic depiction of church and synagogue, not just gone their separate ways, but gone the way of one in triumph and one vanquished. And I want to put alongside that a modern version that actually takes up the name, this Ecclesia et Synagoga, but calls it En Nostra Aetate, in our time. And in this particular version, we see from modern sculptor Joshua Kaufman, an image that's here, a statue that's here in the United States in Philadelphia. And here you look at this image by contrast. We have two women again, same personification motif, but they are equal in stature, they're equal in beauty, they're equal in dignity. They both have crowns, and look at the intimacy. They are almost linking arms as they rub elbows, and they're looking at each other while each of them is engrossed in the reading of their scriptures. The church with a codex, the characteristic Christian form, and the synagogue with the Torah scroll. Rather a complete image of the relationship between church and synagogue, both for our time and perhaps as a way to think about some Christians and some Jews already in the first 3 to 4 centuries. So now I'm going to take this image off.
Yeah, spectacular images. Thank you.
Yeah.
And we, in a separate webinar, we'll be talking, in fact, about iconography, Orthodox iconography. And I know that in this webinar, I'm hoping that we'll talk about text and literature, but thank you so much for that. Jim, I want to follow up with another question, because this webinar is intended for parishes, and predominantly Orthodox parishes throughout America. Today, scholars view Christianity during its initial 100 years of existence as one of many forms of Judaism that existed in the 1st century AD, in the Christian era. How is this understanding of the earliest period in the history of the church reconciled with the idea of the church as something distinctive, as an entity that begins at Pentecost?
Yeah, so it's common for Orthodox Christians to hear the phrase that Pentecost is the birthday of the church. And theologically, there's some power and meaning to that. And I'll come back to that in a second. Let me say a couple words historically, though. I think that observation that church and synagogue are intimately connected in the first 100 years is pretty accurate. Yes, there's distinctions and there are divisions and there are disagreements, and they're not always on the same page, but they're siblings in some sense. So historically, yes, I think Christianity, especially the earliest, Jesus and his disciples, or the earliest Jesus movement and his disciples, are intimately connected with the synagogue, with ancient Israel or 1st century Judaism. And Jill and others on the panel can speak a whole lot more about that. Theologically, though, I think Pentecost for Christians and for Orthodox Christians, because it really is such a significant liturgical event and theological event, does have something to tell at least Christians about the development of church. And I often think about the image that Gregory of Nazianzus, the 4th century bishop, gave in his conversation in one of his sermons slash, arguments about the Trinity. And he's arguing for the divinity of Father, Son, and Spirit. And he makes the point, he makes the observation that the Old Testament revealed God the Father, the New Testament revealed his Son, and the church reveals the Holy Spirit. And in that sense, Pentecost becomes maybe not, and I'm not an expert at this, so those that are could say something, but maybe not when Luke writes it in Acts about the event of Pentecost. I can't speak to how powerful that observation or event was when Luke writes about it in 80, 90 AD. But the interpretation of that event is important for Christian identity. Is it a negative interpretation against Judaism? I'm not prepared to answer that question or not, but I do think it does point to, at least from a theological and ecclesiological point of view, something distinctive has happened at the giving of the Spirit. Yes, something distinctive happened with the crucifixion, death, and resurrection of Jesus, but something else happens with the giving of the Spirit. And I think as a Christian, one doesn't want to lose sight of that. Now, the question is that total separation? Is it at Pentecost? We say the break. I won't say that as a historian for sure. As a theologian, I'm not a theologian per se, but as a Christian, I would think about what does that say about Christian identity as early as, if it's historical, 50 days after the death and resurrection of Jesus.
Thank you. So AJ, let me take this issue of sort of connection and separation even further now. What do you consider to be some of the fundamental similarities and some of the fundamental differences between Jews and Christians, of which many Christians and perhaps even Jews may be unaware?
Well, to pick up from Jim's conversation, which is a really helpful way of starting, part of this depends upon not recognizing our fundamental similarities to begin with. Jesus is a Jew, Peter is a Jew, Paul is a Jew, all those initial disciples, James is a Jew. But because of language, we sometimes lose this. So when we start thinking about ecclesia as church, which has a real strong Christian coding to it, we forget that in the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, ecclesia is the term that Jews use themselves for their own assembly. It's an assembly of Jews. When we think about, you can probably hear the puppy in the background. I'm sorry about that.
Happy to be listening to the puppy, that's fine.
When we think about Jews who are members of this new movement that's gathered around the name of Jesus and inspired by the Spirit, they do not cease to be Jews. So we might think of this as partially a hybrid identity or a sectarian movement within Judaism, as you would have Pharisees and Sadducees, or the followers of John the Baptist. We know even following, this is from the book of Acts, even following the Pentecost scene in Acts 2, Paul continues to go to synagogues. Paul worships in the temple. The followers of Jesus are worshiping in the temple. So there's no sense at all that somehow their Jewish identity has been stripped out, and they don't refer to themselves personally as Christians. Paul continually reinforces his own Jewish identity. On the other hand, when we start talking about Gentiles or pagans who were joining the church, they were never Jews. And for the most part, for Paul, they weren't intended to be Jews, which is why Paul is so adamant that they not submit to circumcision and not carry any of those markers that would distinguish Jews. Because for Paul, the age, you might want to say the age of the church, that would be anachronistic, but for Paul, this new age has broken in. And in this new messianic age, which is marked by the Christ event, the death and resurrection of Jesus, the Gentiles come into the worship of the God of Israel, because that's a sign of the Messianic age. Indeed, to this day, in traditional Judaism, one of the signs of the Messianic age is that all nations turn to worship the God of Israel, who is also the God of the world. Except they don't say, oh, we want to worship in Zion, circumcise me when we get there. So the model is for Paul, the Gentiles remain Gentiles, but they behave as if they are worshiping the God of Israel. They behave according to Israel's moral standards, but they don't convert to Judaism. So on the one hand, you have these Gentiles in the church who were never Jews to begin with. So we can't talk about a separation because they were never part of that Jewish system. And on the other hand, you have Jews in the church who think they're Jews, even when bishops are saying you can't be. Jerome talks about this group of people who he identifies them as Nazareans. And he said, well, their doctrines are fine. I mean, they're good Christians, but they're also following Jewish law. So there must be something wrong with them. Right. We would call them Jewish Christians. They think they're perfectly kosher, they're perfectly fine, and they're perfectly Orthodox. And Jerome thinks they're neither. Yeah. Part of this problem in determining who's in and who's out is who's making the determination. And what Melito of Sardis might say, somebody down the street might differ from him and say, no, 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 you're wrong.
That's fascinating. It's so important to understand the parting in that way and who determines that parting of ways. Margaret, let's pursue this a little further, because I think it's really fundamental. In your opinion, how are the terms Jews and Christians understood differently by Jews and Christians? And how can you address that in an academic setting? So you as a professor, but how do you address that in a religious context, in a parish, for instance, a community? And following on from that, and from the image that you showed us, what are the sort of models for this parting of ways that might work today?
Well, thank you. Let me take up first the linguistic issue, which is a complicated one. As AJ has pointed out, the word Christian is not in Paul's vocabulary. It is not in the vocabulary of any of the four evangelists. We use that term, and eventually we find it in Acts in one place where the author of Acts says it was first at Antioch that they began to be called Christianoi, which means Christies or something like that, like Kikeranioi, like the followers of Cicero or something. And the author of First Peter has the term as well. The word Christianity, Christianismos, which is formed on the word Judaismos, it doesn't appear until the writings or at least in our extant literature, the writings of Ignatius of Antioch, which are at the earliest around 117, something like that. So we have a vocabulary from the development of the Christian tradition for self-identification that they originally did not have. And so interestingly, to AJ's point, I mean, one of the words that Paul uses for these believers who are natal Gentiles, that is, they weren't born Jews, is hagioi. They're holy ones. We would later saints. They're also kletoi. They're those who are called. This is the vocabulary of election of those whom the God of Israel seeks out. And so they're not called Christians, they're called ones. And so what does that mean for us as historians? As I speak now as a historian, it means that we need to be cautious about imputing the tree into the acorn. We need to be cautious about what linguists call phosami, which is words that are false friends. And what that means is they sound like we know what they mean because we impute to them a meaning in our own linguistic system, and we retroject or project that. So I, as in the classroom, and I really appreciate your asking about the different contexts for this. I always, when I'm teaching Paul and the Gospels, I refer Christ believers. I don't use the word Christian because, again, that was not a word that they had. And so that's one way to try to get my students and myself to remember not to put the whole weight of history back into all these acorns. And at the point of those acorns, we have a figure named Paul, who it seems very clear to me historically, and I think more and more is a majority position, although majority scholarship doesn't work just by voting, but that Paul did not convert from something called Judaism to something called Christianity, because there wasn't such a thing as Christianity. Paul was called as a prophet like Jeremiah, as he says in Galatians 1:15-16, fully within his natal religion. And Paul was born and carried out his mission and died as a Jew. So that means we are the ones who need to think differently as we work with with these texts. And hence the idea that Paul is over and against Judaism entirely is an anachronistic and very, in fact, dangerous reading of a text like Galatians. But it is the dominant reading from probably the 4th or century or beyond. And so part of our work as historians is to watch for anachronism and to call it out and think differently about it. So Fozami, we think about what are the terms that we use to analyze that which we're looking at.
Can I just interrupt you there before you move on? I was just thinking that in much of the, at least the ascetic, monastic literature that I research, the term Christian isn't used very much either. It's usually the word those who love Christ, philo Christi.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, because part of my work involves working with his All Holiness, and that the texts that come out of the Patriarchate in very archaic Greek almost never use the word Christians unless there's someone sort of who's drafted it that isn't paying attention. The official word for the Christian people is those named after Christ, the Christeponymi. So I was just interested in the way you were talking there, but please go on.
No, that's very, very helpful. And again, I want to be clear too that the goal isn't to say we can't use the word
Right.
Christian.
Exactly.
Speaking as historians about what becomes the Christian tradition, the question is when and where is not only the word, but the category, which we might think of as something completely separable. So we use a phrase, scholars do, Jewish Christians. And Jim mentioned that term, right? In terms of dialogue with Trypho, and AJ did in terms of Jerome. And we think we know what we mean by that, which is that we mean people who don't fit a single category of either Jew or Christian. There were such persons. There were Torah observant Christians. Justin Martyr in chapter 47 of the dialogue with Trypho refers to them, and he actually says, I think they're wrong to keep the halachic requirements, but they're not damned because they do that, right? And so we have a fair amount of intermixing and the need for openness of the categories. And that's I think the first sort of pedagogical point, without saying though that those who later claim the name Christian aren't claiming something that also claims to have those early roots. So a lot depends on what kind of question we're asking and what we seek from it. The other term we haven't yet problematized, and I think each of us could do so in different ways, is the term Jew. Judaios, again, a possible faux ami, because what later becomes Jew, especially as Jew defined as not Christian, the term Judaios, among its other meanings, means a Judean. And part of this is rooted in the ancient religious ideology that gods and places are linked, that if you live in a certain place, you worship the god of that place. And so the Judeans, the Judaioi, are those who worship the god of the Judeans, who happens to have his temple, his greatest temple in the known world at the time of Paul, there in Jerusalem. Now, some of Judaios, in terms of being an adherent of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that's a part of what it means to be a Judaios too. But each time we see that word within the New Testament, when we're reading it in Greek, we have to ask ourselves, what does the author mean by this term? And so let me give one example, and then I want to hear from other colleagues more than myself. But in the Gospel according to John, famously in many, Jesus is in conflict with people he calls the Jews, hoi Judaioi. And Jesus is himself a Jew. And even in the Gospel of John, Jesus is a Jew. And so what does that mean? It probably means something like those Jews or those Jews over there. It doesn't mean necessarily sort of full category Jews. But every one of us, as we look at it, we have to say, could we translate here Judean? Because then that would get a better sense of Jesus as a Galilean speaking about figures who are from Judah, from Judea. So I hope to open up to people the, wow, what do we do at each of these instances as translators and as thinkers with the core literatures which we're studying?
AJ, did you want to add to
Yes,
that?
very much. To pick up on Margie's point, when we think about Jews and Christians, I think we need to recognize that we are not comported the same way. Christianity is a belief system, right? So somebody in the first century wasn't born a Christ believer. They became a Christ believer through revelation or proclamation or charisma or something. Right? You weren't born into the church. You were, to use Paul's language, you were elected, right? You were graced in. Jews or Judeans, Judaioi can be translated, as Margie pointed out, either way, with a focus on what we would call religion or ethos, or a focus on nationality or ethnicity. To be a Jew in antiquity, to be a Judaios, is not necessarily premised on a belief system. To be a Judaios in the first century is if you have a Judaios as a father, you're a Judaios. And in that sense, if we think about Christianity, there are ethnic branches of Christianity. There's Greek Orthodox, and most people in the Greek Orthodox Church have some sort of Greek heritage. And you know what? There's nothing you can do about it, right? You can't wake up one day and say, I think I want to be an Italian. It's impossible, right? So Jews have always kept this type of ethnic component, which means we are comported as an ethnos, a nation, not a nation state, but a nation, a people, like Egyptians are a people, or Greeks are a people, or Romans are a people. Because of that, it actually makes the way we function as community different. If one gets into a movement by belief, then one gets out of it by belief. So consequently, the early Christian church was very concerned about things like orthodoxy and heresy, because you had to have an orthodoxy, you had to have correct belief in order to be part of that community. Jews comported as an ethnos were less worried about that belief system, so they could argue from dawn to dusk, because at the end of the day, they were all still Jews. Yeah. So when we see Jesus arguing with his fellow Jews about how do you celebrate the Sabbath, for example, or do you have to wash the cup, or is that unimportant? That's an internal Jewish debate. It's not Jesus rejecting Judaism, it's Jesus putting himself in the heart of Judaism and arguing with other Jews as to what does this thing mean. When it comes to the Gospel of John, as Margie pointed out, it's the term Judaios, or Judaioi, the plural, is used 70 or 71 times depending upon manuscript. And you can go through and say, does it mean Judean here? Does it mean Jew here? But I doubt in the performance of the Gospel of John, when it was being read out to congregations, whether in snippets or the whole thing, I don't think Marcus was looking at Livy and saying, do you think this means Judean here? So that from a literary perspective, by the time you get to the end of the Gospel of John, you've got this litany of the Judaioi, and they really represent the cosmos, and the cosmos is somehow opposed to God. So that here's the literary problem, and theologians and ethicists need to weigh in here. In the Passion narrative, when Jesus and Pontius Pilate are having a chat, which also raises questions about in which language are they chatting, Pilate says to Jesus, well, your own people turned you over to me. I'm not a Judaios, am I? And the historical answer is no, you're a pagan Roman. But the literary answer is no, you're a quintessential Judaios, because you're about to condemn Jesus to death. And in John, you have to make a choice. You're either for him or you're against him. Mm-hmm. So we have problems with translation, Jew or Judean. We have problems with how we understand the literature. And we also have problems with the reception history, because when you start going to the fathers and you start thinking about how are they reading these texts, sometimes it's benevolent, but very often it's not. And very often they're reading from their own perspective in the 3rd century and the 4th century. And they're seeing a split, whereas at the time of Jesus, there was an argument, but there wasn't a split.
Fascinating. So let's turn to the texts now, to the literature. John, I want to ask you about the passages in the New Testament. Paul is capable of making some very sharp, even hostile statements against some Jews. In 1 Thessalonians 2, for instance, you killed the Lord, you displease God, you're hostile to everyone. But he also makes a positive assessment regarding Jews in Romans 11. I'm an Israelite. I'm a descendant of Abraham. God did not reject his people. Do not consider yourself superior to others. All Israel will be saved. What is it that Christians today should glean from these seemingly contradictory passages?
Thanks, Father John. Well, let me start by saying I love Paul. I find him very interesting and impressive. And in the Orthodox tradition, of course, he is a saint that I venerate. But I really wish he didn't write those few verses in 1 Thessalonians in the way that he did.
It would have been easier.
Yeah, and if I ever get a chance to ask him, I would really like him to clarify exactly why he said it, why he wrote it the way that he did in 1 Thessalonians. I should probably add here just real quickly, there are a few scholars who've tried to argue that those verses in 1 Thessalonians are an interpolation, that is a non-Pauline insertion, an insertion into the text that Paul didn't write. I think that's probably not a very convincing argument because the Greek manuscript tradition really doesn't support that. I think those words in 1 Thessalonians are definitely aggressive and a bit abusive, to say the least. I do think personally that he's probably not talking about all Jews in general. He's probably has a particular group of Jews who do not recognize Jesus as Lord and Messiah in his mind, probably as a result of his own experiences, the adversity he faced preaching the gospel. That having been said, I don't want to make excuses for Paul, but just to put it in a little bit of context, it's a very difficult and emotionally charged few verses that I really wish Paul would have written differently. That having been said, in his letter to the Romans, especially chapters 9 through 11, I think he is a lot less emotionally charged. He is a lot more composed. He's a lot more careful about what he writes, and he has a much more generally positive assessment of Jews. He can talk about the value of circumcision. He can talk about the promises that God made to Israel that are irrevocable, how wonderful their calling is. And as you said, Father John, in the end, all Israel will be saved. So I think in that sense, Romans, I think the takeaway from those chapters in Romans is that Paul can sometimes tailor his language depending on the situation and the context, which we always don't fully understand today, which would be great to ask him. And I would really like to see, especially in the Orthodox Church, Orthodox Christians in general, and especially priests when they preach during Holy Week, to really emphasize more the positive kind of assessment that Paul has of Israel from Romans, and the concern and the care that he shows for fellow Israelites.
Yeah, thank you. Margaret, same question. It's not just Paul. Jesus in Matthew 23, snakes, vipers, you killed the prophets. How should we understand? How do we misunderstand Jesus and Paul?
Well, I want to affirm and second what my friend John has just said. I think that I'll use an image that's not mine to describe looking at these words. Professor Paula Fredrickson of Boston University and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, in her review of David Nirenberg's book on anti-Judaism, says, when I look at some things in the New Testament, it's like I felt on the morning of 9/11, seeing the pictures of the planes about to go into the World Trade Center and wanting to reach my hand into the TV and say, stop, just stop. And in these words of First Thessalonians 2:14-16, which I agree are sadly, I mean, I wish I could say they're an interpolation and thereby excise them, but I agree with John that I think they're authentic to Paul, but they are written probably 2 decades before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And yet those words echo as though they refer to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, seen as a confirmation of a kind of curse. And that is these are the formative years of what will become the early Gentile predominant Christ-believing communities. And so I want to reach my hand and stop Paul from saying this. For you yourselves became imitators, sisters and brothers, of the assemblies of God, the ones that are in Judea in Christ Jesus. Because you yourselves suffered the same things at the hands of your own fellow people, as also they did at the hands, and here it has to be of the Judeans, because the comparison is between the Thessalonians in their region of Macedonia and the Judeans. So then it slips over and he says, they who killed both the Lord Jesus and the prophets, and who have persecuted us and have not pleased God, but have opposed all people and prevent us from speaking to the Gentiles so that they might be saved, in order that their sins might always be brought to fruition. And the wrath has come upon them at last. I want to put my hand out in front of that, because the wrath has come upon them at last becomes historically fulfilled in the mindset of those who read these words, in the terrible destruction, wanton destruction of the city of Jerusalem and its temple under Titus, the Roman general. And so words become more than they are and become taken in different directions. Historical contextualization helps some, because it allows us to see here that this is a regional, largely regional distinction that Paul is making. But it doesn't completely allow us to get off the hook of the problem, because Paul does say a pretty shocking thing here, that he says that Judeans are those who kill the prophets. And the Matthean Jesus in Matthew 23, at the conclusion of a very bitter chapter in Matthew, whether we think Jesus said those words, I tend to think he didn't, or whether they're in the mouth of that the evangelist has put them in the mouth of a Jesus who knows that the temple is going to be destroyed, because it even says in Matthew 23, behold, your house is desolate. And so the linkage between the two is the development of a Christian tradition that Jews or Israel are those who killed their own prophets. But if you go and look at commentaries on this chapter, what you'll see is that commentators have a really hard time trying to figure out where in the Bible Jews killed their prophets, because there aren't a lot of instances of Jews killing their prophets. Now, Jeremiah did have people throwing him in wells and doing various things to him. But this tradition that's in here, even the one that's given of Zachariah, Huiu Barachiu, there's no such person. Now, it's a confusion of stories from Second Chronicles and other places, but to show you how bad the literary substantiation is of the idea that Israel killed the prophets, in the 3rd century, Origen writes the letter to Africanus, and he has to take up this question, and he says, well, it's true that you can't really find in the scriptures of Israel places where they're killing the prophets, but that's because the Jews, and for Origen, the Jews are other, have edited them out of the scriptures. Now, that's a desperate argument on Origen's part and historically utterly untenable. But what I want to give the biggest impression here is that a tradition developed that didn't have to have developed, but that did, and that had tremendous effects and cost. And so if one wants to get to a vision of the ecclesia and the synagogue for our age, then it requires Christians to repudiate some traditions that they have both created and promulgated, like that the Jews are those who killed their own prophets, or, and Jim mentioned earlier, the text of Melito of Sardis, which is quite clear about the charge of deicide, that Israel killed God in the crucifixion of Jesus. And so this is a weighty inheritance that Christian individuals and communities of faith need to wrestle with. And I really can't improve on what John said about, I love Paul too, and I read and try to figure Paul out. But there are moments when I wish I could say, don't say that.
Yeah. So, I mean, AJ, same question. How much does the context help us? Do we have to condone the approach of these texts today? I mean, I love the approach of let's blame Matthew. I like that one. But what is it that we have to do in response to these texts?
Yes, well, I don't condone texts that promote violence. Historically, as Margie pointed out, we are limited. I do think that this is not an interpolation. I think that Paul wrote those words. I think that Paul wrote those words very early after he changed from being a persecutor of the church to being its foremost apostle. I think he wrote it as if sometimes we do if we go to a foreign nation. So I'll talk about, oh, the American something, something, if I'm not happy with a particular bit of foreign policy. And I hope that the people with whom I'm speaking realize that I'm not speaking about everybody in America, and I clearly don't sign on to that. But that's the way rhetoric works.
Right.
But I don't know. I mean, Paul may well have changed his mind, but if you are of a theological view that Paul is consistent all the way through, then you've got a theological problem. It seems to me under such circumstances that historians cannot do the work that's required to fix the text because we don't have enough information. So it becomes the work of ethicists and theologians. And here, I think the Orthodox communions, much like the Roman Catholic communion, are in a better position to do this than are the Protestants. Because the Orthodox communions and the Catholic communions have ongoing teaching, which has just as much import. It's not just the text, sola scriptura, as Luther would have it. It's how we read it through the centuries. And if we can read it through the centuries in such a way that Melito can accuse the Israelites, can accuse the Jews of killing God, then what we need are theologians and ethicists today to say we need a different vocabulary by which we understand our own theology. Judaism has the same thing, so that when I, as a Jew, look at some of the material in my scripture, Ezekiel, who has some problems with women, or Joshua, which is basically genocide against the Canaanites, I cringe. But I come from an interpretive tradition that provides me certain lenses by which I can understand those texts as problems, rather than, well, it's, the text says it and it's from God and that's the end of it. No, they're problems. And if we are to claim to be Israel, then our job in part is to wrestle with that text, because that's what the word Israel means, is to wrestle with God. So what do we do with 1 Thessalonians 2? And what do we do with some of the stuff in Galatians? And what do we do with Matthew 23 or John 8 or any of those problematic passages? We wrestle with them rather than just say that's the word of God and that's the end of it.
Yeah.
Because if we do that, then I think we're worshiping the Bible. That's bibliolatry, rather than worshiping the deity to which the text points. Right. And that's why we need ethicists and theologians and storytellers to help us.
Very, very helpful. So, John, is it even appropriate to use the term anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism in relation to these New Testament texts?
Father, I think here we kind of get back to some of the language, some of the terminology, again, that we're somewhat limited by the terminology in terms of making that distinction between Jews and Christians for New Testament texts and what that means and who we're talking about. So we're in some ways limited by the language. With that having been said, I think different people might answer that question differently. From my perspective, I think, yes, there are texts like 1 Thessalonians we just talked about that do express anti-Judaism. Anti-Semitism might be another matter. I think it would depend on on how people define it. I think many scholars would define anti-Semitism as being a modern phenomenon based on race, whereas anti-Judaism would be more theological, rhetorical, invective, religious language. So do we have some anti-Jewish text in a sense in the New Testament? I'm ashamed to say that I think we do. And again, this gets to our earlier discussion, as AJ was just saying, where we need this later interpretive tradition to be able to be attention on some of those texts and to force us to think critically about how we're reading these texts and how we're using these texts. Because certainly whatever Paul's intention was, getting back to 1 Thessalonians, whatever Paul's intentions were with that text, those verses, the way verses like that and other texts that were just mentioned by Margaret and AJ, they've been used historically by Christian preachers, by nation states, by governments, by politicians in anti-Semitic ways. Of course, that's unacceptable and highly problematic.
Yeah. I do like the idea that AJ said of Paul, the early Paul writing this stuff, the enthusiastic convert writing this stuff. So let's move on from the New Testament to the period after that. And Jim, I wonder if you can tell us briefly, what is it that we can draw from early Christian literature or even legislation about relations between Jews and Christians in the post-New Testament era? And are there examples, for instance, from the pre-Constantinian or even the Constantinian church that illustrate a somewhat more positive articulation of Jews and Judaism? Unmute, Jim.
Thank you. I think the post-New Testament literature reflects what is actually happening in the New Testament literature, and that is conflict and identity, in the sense that how does one identify oneself vis-a-vis ancient Israel, vis-a-vis my neighbor that's going down to synagogue or to temple, vis-a-vis what Paul is doing, if I even know, or if I'm in Jerusalem, if I even know what Paul is doing. It's just exacerbated, I think, as time goes on. And so I think a lot of the polemics, anti-Jewish polemic that one starts to see in Christian writings in the 2nd century, and I can't speak for rabbinic writings, but I would imagine that some of that is some of the anti-Christian writings in rabbinic texts are probably, they really say more about entities trying to define themselves, and it's oftentimes easier to define yourself by saying what you're not. And those people over there, that's who we aren't. We're not those people over there. And so you see a lot of that. And it really, so to look for positive statements about Judaism is hard. However, one has to remember that in the end of the into the 2nd century, much of what the Christians are doing is Jewish. They're praying daily. They're fasting twice a week. They're baptizing and having Eucharist, which are, have Jewish roots. And so it's, the texts themselves might say bad things and anti-Jewish things, but I think it's much more complicated than that. Having said that, I would point out a couple of texts that on the surface might reflect some positive elements that writers of the 2nd and early 3rd century might say about Jews in particular. Back to Justin Martyr, and I'm no expert on Justin Martyr, but in his dialogue with Trypho, and those of you who worked more on Justin and his dialogue could chime in on this, I'm always struck by, and I'm sure it's a rhetorical decision on Justin's part, but I'm always struck that Trypho doesn't convert. He doesn't convert to Christianity. So did Justin fail to convince him? Or was Justin not interested in trying to convince him? And certainly Justin reflects a lot of content that 2nd century Judaism is experiencing, etc. However, Justin also is the first one to say that Christianity is a true Israel. That's tough. That's a tough one. And I think for Orthodox Christians in particular, we haven't wrestled, and back to AJ's point, that theologians and ethicists need to wrestle with this. We haven't wrestled with the language of, we're the new Israel, we are the true Israel. This language is embedded in our hymnography. And we haven't done a good job of responding to that. And it comes in second century texts. But I would also point out, in addition to Justin, I might say Clement of Alexandria, he talks about the law as the Mosaic law as having a positive impact, as being a moral, ethical kind of tool for the ancient Israelites. So that's sort of positive. Origen, when he is in Palestine, in Caesarea, he tells us that he actually went and visited the rabbinic teaching, the schools there, to get some ideas and information about how they read their texts. So, and Origen himself writes this Hexapla, which is this six column text on the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. And so in that sense, I think Origen has a deep respect for the Israelite tradition. I don't know how much respect he has for Jews. I can't speak to that. But I think you're hard pressed. Nobody's writing, here are the Jews. Let's say positive things about the Jews in the 2nd and 3rd century. They're not doing, Christians aren't, or at least those texts haven't survived.
There are very few texts, very few stories. It's true. Again, the area that I enjoy studying, the early monastic tradition, there's wonderful correspondence, almost like a spiritual correspondence course in the 6th century texts of Barsanuphius and John, who lived in Gaza. And people would go to their hermitage and slip a note under their door, because nobody saw these two hermits. So you never spoke to them, you never saw them. You slipped a note under the door and you got the answer sort of slipped out of the door next day. And one of the questions is from a layperson in the Gaza region who has a field, and he says, I've got a beautiful vineyard, and God is good. He helps with the vines. They grow every year, and I get beautiful grapes every year. And I know I could make more money for my family if I had a wine presser, but I don't have one. My neighbor has one, but he's a Jew. Should I ask my neighbor for his wine presser? And Barsanuphius and John slips out the response. Barsanuphius says to him, go out on a day when it's sunny, and then go out on a day when it's rainy. If on the rainy day it's raining in your field but not in the Jews, don't use his wine presser. But if it's raining in both fields, go ahead and use the wine presser. There are some small examples like this, but of course the biggie for us, Margaret, is St. John Chrysostom. And of course you study him a lot. How can a figure like St. John Chrysostom, one of the most popular saints, one of the most passionate advocates of social and economic justice, how can such a person also be a spokesman for brutal and dangerous anti-Jewish invective?
Well, it's, I have been reading John for many decades, and I find him utterly fascinating. And as a preacher, he is non-pareil. I mean, he really uses the language in very powerful ways. And that is the beauty of his legacy. But when it comes to the powerful invective against Jews in the 8 discourses adversus Judaeos that come down through history as though against Jews, he is one of the most powerful voices of outrageous and mean and vicious invective against Jews. Modern voices, not all, some have argued that actually we shouldn't title those discourses against Judaizing Christians, that John's main objection in those homilies is not Jews as Jews so much as Jews as luring Christians to the synagogue, both for Shabbat service and for festival celebrations, and for healing magic and healing procedures and things like that. I think that there's something there. I do think that the sermons of Chrysostom do show us that there were Christ believers, Christians, who thought they could be part of both communities, at least partly. And so that's a social fact that unsettles the confident division that Chrysostom is seeking to insist upon. Now, there are some in the parting of the ways discussions who would strongly maintain that people on the ground were not separated, Jews and Christians, but it was the ecclesiastical scolds who were trying to create different communities where there were not different communities. I think there's a grain of truth or accuracy in that, but I don't think that can be the full solution. For one thing, because Chrysostom was a very popular homilist, and he was a very keen rhetorician. And the way that he introduces anti-Jewish invective in his homilies is not in a way that he thinks it's immediately going to split his audiences. The way in which Baptist preachers in the 1960s in the South in America knew if they brought up race relations, they would automatically, there would be the divide between those who would be in favor of civil rights and those opposed. I don't quite feel the anxiety in John that he thinks that people on the ground will automatically be opposed to his rhetoric. So we're left with a complicated legacy there, with a post-history that went far beyond Antioch, where he delivered these 8 discourses, and they were widely influential in the West as well as in the East. And so that's also, I teach on John in any number of contexts, Christian, Jewish, non-religiously affiliated, and all Jewish audiences whom I speak to whom I speak about Chrysostom. The one thing they've heard about him is that he's responsible for those discourses against us. And so that is a part of the legacy of Chrysostom. At the same time, I want to raise up to your earlier question, both about John and also about your question to Jim about positive voices in the early church. So I've already said that it seems pretty clear that Chrysostom is anxious about Christians going to synagogue because they were. So that in itself is a very interesting social fact that that should give us pause. And I would add to it, there are other pieces of evidence, but one that I always think about is that in the canons of the Council of Laodicea in 363 to 364 is the rule that Christians can't accept Passover bread from Jews. And I've always thought, like, this is neighbors. These are neighbors who are sharing in each other's liturgical traditions in some way. And that strikes me as a hopeful thing, living as I do, and I think as all of you do, in contexts where more and more Jews and Christians salute one another in their times of liturgical celebration and take joy in what our neighbors, whatever our own affiliations are celebrating. And then a last point from Chrysostom, because it's one of my homilies that I just translated in this book you kindly mentioned. In John's homily on Romans 12:20, he goes on for at least 25 minutes complaining that Christians are not coming to church. It's a very sort of modern sounding complaint. He goes on and on about this. And as one of his examples, he says, people get up early in the morning in order to stand in line to get tickets for the theater. And as you know, John especially sees the theater as a competitor. And then instead of complete excoriation, he then says, and look at the Jews. He says, they are so faithful to their law that if they are in the midst of exacting a sale or some kind of business affair, when the Shabbat comes, they stop and they will not accept payment because it's the Sabbath. And so he goes on at some length about the power and dignity of the example of Jewish fidelity to the law, which is remarkable. And then sorry to say, break the moment, he then goes on to say, of course, they shouldn't be keeping the law because Christ is the end of the law, according to Romans 10:4, and so on. But there's this moment of civic and public recognition of
Admiration.
the goodness of the other, that maybe gives us a bit of a glimmer of hope that even those voices that are mostly trying to emphasize difference are capable of testifying to the goodness of even what they view as their bitter rivals.
So thank you so much. AJ, what do you have to say about this? These complex legacies that have come down to us, and how we should receive them and how we should interpret them. You have to unmute, AJ.
To Margaret's point about those brief moments of praise to the person who is your enemy, in pretty much all of the sources we have, there are those little brief moments which suggest that the vehemence is not consistent. Even in the Gospel of John, in John 11, the story of the raising of Lazarus, John writes, and the Jews came to comfort Mary and Martha, right? It doesn't matter what you think religiously, and even though they know that Mary and Martha are like really, really good friends of Jesus, somebody dies, you bring a chicken, right? I mean, you do something, because that's what neighbors do in terms of mourning. Yeah. At the end of the dialogue with Trypho, they actually part as friends and say, we ought to do this again sometime. Right. Which shows us that we can disagree on religion. We can disagree firmly on belief, and we might use heightened language, but we can still remain in conversation. We can still be friends without eliminating or sacrificing the particulars of our own belief on this altar of interfaith sensitivity. So that when we talk about Christian-Jewish relations, it doesn't mean that Christians should give up on the Trinity and give up on the Christ, and it doesn't mean that all Jews should rush down to baptism. But we can stay with our differences, but recognize our commonalities and then celebrate both. When it comes to Chrysostom, we've got this problem of what's sometimes called presentism, where we import our own values back into people in the past. We've seen that today with questions of should statues of Civil War, people from the Confederacy, should those statues still stand? I live in Tennessee. This is very visceral to me here. And others are saying, no, we are judging people hundreds of years ago by our own standards. And how do we do that? Mm-hmm. People are human beings. And John Chrysostom said some dreadful things. So did Martin Luther. So did the early suffragettes when it came to Jews and in a number of cases to African Americans, to Black people. What do? We lift up the good stuff, but we also recognize the problematic stuff. And if we are from a tradition that says that somehow revelation is ongoing, that the work of theology is not done, then what we need to do is say, how do we claim this as our own, even if it's problematic, and then say, but this part we reject, or this is the part that should be accentuated, and we don't erase the problems. We recognize them and then say, thank God we're part of a tradition that allows us to move on.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, so in the end, in terms of not just in parishes and in communities, but in seminaries, for instance, in church and in preaching, there should be this open conversation, this open discussion, readiness.
We should have the ears to allow us to hear the problems, because too often we're simply tone deaf to it, and we don't recognize that what we're saying might create or reinforce hate. Yep. So we need to be speaking with each other to provide these corrections. Chrysostom, I think some of those congregants in Chrysostom's church were going to the synagogue because the people in the synagogue were friendly, because they were giving healing, because they were eating when Chrysostom is pushing fasting. And because for some of those pagans, the Jews had the real deal. They had the real Torah scrolls with the real Hebrew, right? And Jesus according to the flesh. So what does that tell us now? In the 21st century, it is perfectly okay for a member of the Greek Orthodox Church to call up a local rabbi, say from a Reform or conservative congregation, and say, can I come visit your service?
Exactly.
And it would be very nice if Jews would do the same. Orthodoxy is less likely to happen. But so that we get to attend each other's services, not for reasons of proselytization, but to get to know our neighbor, which is what we're supposed to be doing anyway. And we, again, see the differences and we can celebrate those and say, well, I don't agree with you here, but I see why you do it. But we can also see the strong commonalities we have between what I experienced in the Orthodox synagogue and what a member of the Greek Orthodox community would experience in church. And you say, oh my God, that's the same. You do Psalms, we do Psalms.
Yep.
You have a reading of the text, we have a reading of the text. You have a word of encouragement, we have a word of encouragement. You have food after, so do we. And then we can share.
I want to leave it there. I think that's the note, that's the tone that's coming out of the various webinars that we're doing on anti-Semitism, that it's a matter of connecting as friends, listening, as AJ just said. So I don't know how to thank you enough. Dr. Levine, Dr. Fotopoulos, Dr. Mitchell, and Dr. Skedros, thank you so much for sharing your time and your thoughts. I do sincerely hope that this is a new beginning to a very vital conversation in our church. And my thanks to all of you for watching and listening.